Welcome to this week's edition of The World Unraveled with Brandon Kinnig. Your loyal and unwavering host is back for the second episode in this new podcast series. I realized that last week in the launch episode, I failed to discuss format and types of topics we would be tackling, so I want to address that now. I'm going to discuss elections around the world as they occur, including their impact on American relations and foreign policy. I'm also going to provide updates on conflicts around the globe, such as the war in Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the civil war in Sudan, collapse of civil society in Haiti, and many more. I'll provide real time analysis of extemporaneous events that impact global trade and diplomatic relations, such as climate catastrophes, foreign hacking attempts, espionage events, etc. And I'll discuss significant milestones as they relate to multinational organizations, international alliances, mutual defense pacts, and trade agreements, including the UN, EU, NATO, ANZUS, Trans-Pacific Partnership, any news among those organizations and agreements. And I'll also provide special guest interviews and commentary from time to time with an eye towards including guests who have expertise in specific areas and specialized knowledge. In all of these instances, I'm going to strive to provide historical context for various nation states' cultural attitudes and foreign policy stances, such as prior American interference in elections, CIA involved coups, and the ongoing legacy of neocolonialism. Additionally, I'm going to have reoccurring segments as well, such as Democracy versus Autocracy Scorecard. With this segment, I'm going to provide updates on the escalating threats against liberal democracy from within, such as backsliding in countries like Hungary, as well as the increasing alliance of authoritarian states and the threat that this alliance, China, North Korea, Russia, poses to uh, global Western democracy. I'll track wins, losses in this global high stakes battle for a stable and democratic world. The war in Ukraine. I'll provide periodic updates in this 2.5 year ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and what it means for the West. I'll also have a segment called Around the World in 60 Seconds, where I just provide snapshot updates on what is happening around the globe, including some smaller, lesser known items that warrant and deserve highlighting, but do not have enough to include in a long-winded discussion. Disinformation Nation. This is a segment where I will discuss the ongoing role of disinformation in American society and in other countries, particularly our allies, and who is responsible, updates in specific players and actors, wrongdoers, being able to spot disinformation, a checklist for assisting friends and family with being able to root out disinformation and ensure that it's not part of your decision-making criteria when analyzing the news. And another segment that I will have is one last thing. This will be how I typically end the podcast. It'll be a grab bag of either several issues or a single issue news item, a personality, or a quote of the week that I just want to highlight. It could also be an update or a clarification to a prior podcast topic, but just a good way to end the podcast with something that is miscellaneous, that doesn't necessarily relate to some of the other topics. So, without further ado, today I want to discuss the news that uh, the Trump campaign apparently fell victim to a hacking attempt. We don't know the details. The Trump administration, I should say the Trump campaign, immediately claimed that it was an attempt by Iran and that no valuable information was taken. We do know that it was likely a foreign actor. We still don't know who. The FBI is investigating. Microsoft did issue a warning that there was an attempt by Iran to infiltrate their networks, and so this had um, gone out about a week prior to this most recent attempt. But still, we don't know the details, and we don't know for sure that it was Iran or an Iran adjacent foreign actor or ally or paid hire. But the Trump campaign was very quick to point fingers at Iran, and also, again, ironically, very quick to claim that any news organizations that published any information gained from this hack would be doing the bidding of a foreign actor. And that is just incredibly ironic coming from the Trump campaign, who begged Russia to hack into Hillary Clinton's emails during the 2016 race and then gleefully used that information and peddled it among right wing news as well as mainstream media. Many people credit that for being a turning point in the 2016 election, leading to Hillary Clinton's loss, among other things. But again, irony is not dead when it comes to the Trump campaign. The hypocrisy just goes over the heads of anybody who works on that campaign. But this does raise an important point, that these types of hacking attempts are likely only going to grow and increase as we get closer to the November election, less than 90 days out at this point. And we also do know now from the FBI investigation that the Harris Wall campaign was also a target. We just doesn't appear that their infrastructure was breached. And from what has been ascertained so far in this ongoing investigation, we know that opposition research on JD Vance was a target. Some of that was obtained. We know news organizations have some of the information because this hacker did forward the information gleaned to several news organizations. None of them have published that yet. It's created a debate on whether or not news media should or should have published. We know that in the 2016 election, there were no qualms among the news media. They published all of the details from Hillary Clinton's emails. Now they seem to be taking a much more cautious approach, which I think some would argue is warranted and good. But there's also a case to be made that in the case of opposition research, in the case of uh, campaigns' internal deliberations, that there may be value, especially since this information is now held by many in the media, to publishing that or making it public for the American people to decide as part of their decision-making process. I'm conflicted on that. I don't necessarily believe that it's giving credence to foreign actors like Iran or validating their work when publishing that. I think it all comes down to the nature of the information. Um, for example, if this was highly secure, confidential, secret information, or national security related, there's no question that that information should be published. If you're talking about how a campaign assesses a particular candidate to be on their ticket, I think there's an argument to be made that if that information is within the media now, then why not publish it? But there's a legitimate debate to be had over that, how to handle it, how to strike back at these foreign actors. We clearly need to have all hands on deck as far as our national security apparatus and our information security teams to ensure that these attempts are not successful in the future. Well, we also learned that Roger Stone's email was hacked as well. This is another point of irony and that could not go unvisited. If you recall, Roger Stone, the dirty trickster who has been a campaign advisor to Trump going back to 2016, he was one of the people that was gleefully encouraging Russia to hack into Hillary's emails, and then responsible for helping to procure the hacked information from WikiLeaks, to the point that he was actually charged by special counsel Robert Mueller at the time and faced criminal charges and jail time. and it's come full circle now that the fact that he his own email has been hacked. But again, you can't make this stuff up. So we know that there are foreign actors like Russia, like North Korea, like China, and Iran who want to do this. I do want to focus for a second on Iran because Iran has been an adversary of the U.S. for many decades now. Very anti-Western in attitude, very anti-American. We've seen the videos of Iranians burning American flags in the street. The image we have of Iran, though, is much more nuanced than most Americans probably see just in media reports and in the limited version we have. What most Americans know about Iran just goes back to 1979 during the Iranian hostage crisis and the revolution, in which the Shah was overthrown and replaced with a theocratic government run by the Ayatollah Khomeini. But that ignores a lot of prior history and context as to why we got here today, and a failure to recognize our own involvement for why Iran is a potential nuclear power today, continues to try to obtain and use nuclear weapons, and why there's such a danger on the world stage. We played a major part in that, and that should be recognized. To understand the roots of Iran's current isolationism and hostility towards the West, you really need to go back many decades before 1979, when the Shah, who's essentially a monarch, was deposed and replaced with an Islamist government, and all power was vested in practice, if not in theory, in the religious leader known as the Ayatollah. You go back to the early 20th century, and even before that, the late 19th century, talking about the late 1800s, there's a history of neocolonialism with the British and the Russians exploiting Iran's petroleum resources, starting in 1901, when the then ruling Shah granted the British a 60-year right for the search for oil. And strike oil the British did in many different places. For the next 78 years, Iran's oil was systematically extracted and depleted by Britain and Russia as the nation was used as a chess piece, essentially, and then a colonial possession, and then as a Cold War proxy by Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. The monopolistic control over a country's oil extended to control over the political elites, resulting in a series of coups and government changes, all orchestrated at first by the British and then later the British and the Americans. The British and the Russians initially created a consistent pattern of interference in Iranian political affairs. This was to protect their own interests, resulting in these powers always opposing any efforts towards popular democracy in Iran. The Persian Cultural Revolution and resulting constitution of 1906 created a democratically elected parliament in Iran for the first time to make laws, as well as the establishment of a prime minister to execute those laws. This was seen as a balance and check to the power of the Shah. But the British and the Russians attempted to subvert these democratic reforms at every turn, again, because they saw this as a threat to their oil operations, which produced not only resources for the British, but substantial revenue for their empire at the time. So you have a country that's only semi-independent, that has much of its resources controlled by a foreign power, as well as its political structure, with a population that's agitating towards democracy, making some democratic inroads, slowly but surely, despite British and Russian pushback. And also at this time, you have the British form a corporate conglomerate known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC, which exercised nearly unfettered control over Iran's resources and political leadership. And despite the word Persian in the title, this British oil conglomerate, which we know today as British Petroleum or BP gas stations for those of us in the United States familiar with the brand, this uh, corporate entity only allocated a meager 16% of oil profits back to Iran, back to the country whose petroleum they were essentially stealing. So 84% of the profits are going directly to Great Britain. to enrich their empire and their expansionist designs. And then APOC would later become known as AIOC, uh, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as the name Persia changed to Iran. So Britain is developing this massive corporate monopoly with APOC, depleting the country of its natural resources. There's a populist uprising and a unrest wanting democracy as Britain essentially kind of controls the Shah through these oil rights that had been negotiated starting in 1901. British had began exploring and trading with Iran going back into the mid 1850s through the 1870s, attempting to find oil. So Britain staged their first coup in 1921. They added a general, Reza Khan, to the government. He became prime minister in 1923 and then later Shah in 1925. And he started embarking on a program of modernization for the country. There were many pros and cons to this. Iran was able to modernize, educational opportunities for the population, growth in infrastructure, which didn't exist throughout the country before. Yet the Shah ruled with an iron fist. He stifled dissent, he threw dissidents in jail. One of those political opponents who was jailed was Mohammad Mossadegh. An authoritarian rule left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was this experience that would cause him to become a freedom fighter and to take on a greater role down the line in Iranian affairs and to argue for Iranian control of the country's oil resources and expelling the British, essentially nationalizing oil reserves. So the new Shah, Reza Khan, tried to renegotiate the profit sharing agreement with Britain regarding oil rights to give his country more of the profits, but he was unsuccessful. He attempted to play umpire between the colonizers, between Britain and Russia, and the Iranian public, but Britain now saw him as a potential problem. This was exacerbated when the Shah attempted political neutrality during World War II. So Britain did not find this to their liking. They were also afraid that Germany may try to take over petroleum reserves and they would lose part of their empire during the Second World War. So, to remedy this, in 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Iran directly to remove any of the German influence and secure the oil fields. Reza Khan was deposed by Britain. If you're keeping track, this is the second coup instigated by Britain. The first one was the coup that installed him in the first place, and here's the second coup, which is removing him from power now. So he was deposed by the British and replaced with his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was now the new Shah. During this period, the authoritarianism that had been instituted by um, Pahlavi's father was mostly rolled back. Much of democracy was restored. So this was a relatively stable period. The British then withdrew their occupying force after the war ended, but the Soviets remained, and they sponsored two controlled zones within Iran, which they dubbed People's Republics. This is a factor of Russian control. As you may note, we see this in the modern age with Russian designs on Ukraine and the Donetsk region, for example, where they basically create these zones of influence and control. They rename them as people's republics, claim that the people there are backing them and supporting them, when in many cases, they are paying people to fake support for them, or they are bringing in Russians. So this is not anything new, what we see today in Ukraine. This was happening in Iran under the Soviets. So the U.S. began getting involved and they started pushing Iranian leadership to reassert control. And the Russians were forced out along with their World War II era oil claims, which were now null and void. So Russian designs on the oil were now eliminated with end of the World War, and it was just Britain now with the monopoly status on oil. During this time, the Iranian public was becoming increasingly vocal against British imperialism and the oil conglomerate AIOC, the British monopoly. An attempted assassination on the Shah in 1949 resulted in consolidation of power and creeping authoritarianism once again, uh, increasing more power in the Shah as a response to that attempt under the guise of providing stability. We see that time and time again as a open door to autocracy. Mossadegh, if you remember, Mohammad Mossadegh was had been jailed for sedition under the previous Shah, populist. He and his supporters now form a political organization called the National Front, arguing for nationalization of Iran's petroleum reserves. They also argue for the Shah being a ceremonial monarch, not an absolute monarch. And Mossadegh was taking this from the British imperialists. He saw that the British constitutional monarch, as well as the movement in Europe to constitutional monarchy away from absolute monarchs, in which the monarch plays just a ceremonial role and power is invested in the prime minister and then the parliament or national assembly, that was the way to go. So this was a positive aspect of European colonization that Mossadegh took away, unlike the many negative aspects, and he began arguing for it. A turning point then occurred in 1951 when Mossadegh's National Front won a majority of seats in parliament. So there's tension begins to build now. So you have this National Front organization led by this charismatic young leader, very populist, very democratic, reform leaning, and his party now has majority in parliament. And so he begins mobilizing. He forms an unsteady alliance with Ayatollah Kashani, who was a mentor to the future Ayatollah Khomeini, who's in charge today. Um, Again, there was a difference there because Mossadegh was secular. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted a religious state, but they had a common enemy in the Shah and in the Shah's anti-democratic authoritarian tendencies, and in their common belief that the British imperialists needed to be pushed out of Iran, and Iran needed ownership of their natural resources. So this began a very destabilizing period in Iran. Despite Mossadegh and Kasani being allies of convenience, um, there were attacks between um, National Front's supporters attacking the Shah's supporters, mob riots, and um, and so this continued for some time. And there were rising tensions in the region, and the Shah began to see Mossadegh as a deep threat to his rule and to his ongoing power. Um, and in 1952, the Shah actually, by this point, Mossadegh had been elected prime minister, so he had the political power essentially in the country. The Shah still wielded enormous uh, power as a semi-legitimate monarch with not ceremonial. And in 1952, the Shah actually dismissed Mossadegh, which he had the power to do, because again, he was still somewhat of an absolute monarch at the time. But there were widespread public protests, so he immediately reinstated Mossadegh as prime minister. In late 1951, Iran's parliament voted near unanimously to nationalize oil. And this was the catalyst for Britain realizing that it had a huge problem on its hands. Millions of Iranians supported the move. They supported Mossadegh's calls for nationalization as the prime minister. Mossadegh's political fortunes were growing as he was hailed as a national hero, and so Britain then began enlisting the help of America at this point. And it should be noted that under President Truman, America was very hesitant to get involved. In fact, the position of the United States at the time was that they would not assist Britain um, in those efforts. They saw it as destabilizing. They were not going to get involved at all. But now there were active calls, and the U.S. State Department at this point had already rejected um, British demands that they alone benefit and control the Iranian oil reserves. Um, but now the tide was turning, and the United States was the recipient of much outreach by Britain to assist them in actually undermining and overthrowing the Iranian government. And so this started creating tension. So talks began. Winston Churchill became prime minister after World War II. Eisenhower became U.S. president. And during this time, the U.S. had attempted to broker a deal where essentially um, oil refineries would be sold to non-British companies to just create more diversity in terms of control and ownership to help remove some of the populist tensions in Iranian society against the British, uh, just cool things off essentially. And that deal was rejected by the British. And so there was a stalemate approaching. And at this time, too, Britain decided that they had no choice after the Parliament vote to nationalize the oil industry. They began an embargo of Iranian oil in mid 1952. And this embargo was devastating. I mean, it resulted in mass poverty among the Iranian population. There was no inflow of trade of goods into Iran. And um, Mossadegh, the prime minister at the time, sought help from President Truman and the World Bank to no avail. The United States government didn't approve of the embargo, but they were not willing to stand up to Britain either. So it was a very uncomfortable position for the United States. This in turn caused the Iranian population to become more opposed to the British, and they supported Mossadegh in great numbers. And at this point, the Communist Party locally, which was a holdover from the Soviet Union imperialism in Iran, began to ally itself and support Mossadegh and create an unsteady alliance that would come back to bite Mossadegh. At this point, by 1953, this resulting British embargo and political turmoil took a major toll on the country's financial health, and there were began talks about a coup. Um, Great Britain and the reach out to the United States and receive support for a coup, what was called by the CIA as Operation Ajax, to remove Mossadegh from power, dissolve parliament, and give the Shah complete power to rule, essentially dictatorial powers. And so this occurred. Some question as to whether President Eisenhower was moved by the threats of communism or by the threat of having Iranians completely in control of the oil resources and what that would do to destabilizing the markets. It was likely a combination of both, but there's no question that the British exploited the newfound Cold War tension and the fears of American policymakers that Russia, the Soviet Union, was gaining and advancing in satellite states, that would happen in Iran. In fact, the British pointed towards the local Communist Party's support and alignment with Mossadegh as reason enough to fear that the Soviets were funding that, and that if Mossadegh would be allowed to remain in power and oil resources would be nationalized, that it would result in Iran becoming a Soviet satellite state, and that the Soviet Union would have unfettered access to oil reserves. Looking back on that now, it's preposterous, and the local Communist Party was never going to be a major force in Iranian politics. But again, you have to look at it from the context of the times. The fear was there, and this spoke specifically to the fears that American policymakers had, and it was one of the key uh, reasons that they decided to align themselves with Britain, and that the CIA joined MI5 in this coup, what became known as Coup 53. And I don't want to speak in length about this because it's a uh, so much detail to cover, but it is a fascinating episode in history that many Americans know very little about. The MI5 and CIA actually funded, paid upright protesters and actors to, and they spread false propaganda about Mossadegh and his party and about what nationalization of the oil industry would do. They instigated riots uh, a- and fights, violent demonstrations in the streets, much of which were either paid actors or people hired by the CIA and MI5. And the end result of the bloody street battles were several hundred people killed. Mossadegh and his supporters were arrested. Mossadegh would face the rest of his life, much of his life in prison, and then the rest of it until his death and under house arrest. Many of his supporters were executed summarily. The CIA, for the longest time, refused to comment on Operation Ajax or claim credit for this coup, really up until 2013, is when they did. But one of the key events coming out of this is that the Shah was installed against popular Iranian support, basically with very high opposition, and basically ruled as a dictator with American support, allowing foreign control and ownership of Iran's petroleum reserves, creating this bubbling of ill will towards America, Britain, and the West, which would eventually rise to a boiling point, culminating in the 1979 Iranian Revolution hostage crisis. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It was due to the preceding um, 35, 38 years of um, American involvement, including three coups instigated by the British prior to the major coup that removed their popular prime minister and forever cemented the Shah as an absolute monarch, obliterating the hopes that Iran would become a fully functioning democracy with merely a constitutional or ceremonial monarch. But one of the conditions for restoring the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company after this coup was over in 1953, the U.S. did require removal of AIOC's monopoly. So there was a long-standing belief among United States policymakers and diplomats that of course Britain should never have been doing this in the first place, but also their monopoly status was at the core of all of this instability. So, five American petroleum companies, along with Royal Dutch Shell and the French oil company, were allowed to partake of Iran's petroleum. It didn't change anything, I should say, for Iran because they continued to not have control. But control was no longer Britain's alone after this, um, despite the fact that Shah declared this to be a quote unquote victory for the Iranians, even though it was anything but. If you want to read more about Coup 53, Operation Ajax, and the inner dynamics of what happened, there's a really good documentary called Coup 53 that was released in 2019. I happened to see it at the Palm Springs International Film Festival, directed by Walter Murch, who many may know as a world-renowned um, sound engineer and technician, as well as producer. But he has directed a few pieces, and this was one of them. He goes pretty in depth into this, and it's remarkable work where he interviews people that are alive today, including former spies with MI5, CIA, some of them off the record, to uncover the truth about this episode, which involves both U.S., British history, and many more. It's a and I it has some reenactments. They actually brought in, I believe, is it Joseph Fiennes? No, Ralph Fiennes, the actor Ralph Fiennes, British actor, was brought in to read the role of the lead MI5, MI6 agent who was spearheading the operation, what CIA dubbed Operation Ajax Coup 53 on the British side. And there's just a lot of suspense in this documentary, including some of the records that were just found within the last 5 to 10 years, which are exposed in this film. So highly recommend it. Um, it is available online if you go to uh, coup53.com. That's COUP53.com. You can pay a couple bucks to watch the film. There are screenings from time to time in different American cities and other cities around the globe. But it'll give you more detailed insights. But I just wanted to provide that brief synopsis of the historical context for now, so you understand that, when we're facing these situations like attempted Iranian influence in our elections or hacking attempts, which are very serious and very real, and Iran is a very serious threat to us, but it's also a threat that we perhaps inadvertently helped create through our own interference and policies in their country, and it's something we should be mindful of. Well, that's all for this week's edition. One last thing, uh, as far as epidemics and pandemics go, there seems to be an mpox, another round of monkeypox that it's making its way through the Congo and sub-Saharan Africa, on the rise at pandemic level. Something to follow for those of you who are aware of infectious diseases and how those can, as we've seen, not only through COVID, but with Ebola, and in cases of other infectious diseases, those can not only cause alarm, but become extreme economic disruptors and destabilizing events. So something we'll be watching closely and reporting more on as items develop on the ground in the Congo. But that's all for now. Stay safe, friends. Talk to you soon, and have a great week.